In 1981, in San Francisco, Chris is struggling to make ends meet selling fancy bone scanners. Each day, he drops off his son Junior at daycare and hustles to peddle these pricey gadgets at as many hospitals as he can. Unfortunately, they're a tough sell because they're not really necessary and cost a pretty penny. When he takes the bus, he often runs into a peculiar homeless man who calls the scanner a time machine. Sometimes, Chris has to stay out longer to try and make a sale, so he asks his wife Linda to pick up their son. This always irks her because she's already working extra shifts to support the family. One evening during dinner, Chris stumbles upon a Rubik's Cube, the latest craze and a gift from one of Linda's friends. She inquires about the tax payments, but Chris plans to file an extension, which only adds to Linda's frustration. That night, Chris toys with the cube and solves it with surprising speed. The next day, while out on his sales rounds, Chris encounters a man stepping out of a swanky sports car. Curious, Chris asks about the man's occupation, to which he replies that he's a stockbroker. Chris is under the impression that one needs a college degree for such a job, but the man insists it's more about being sharp with numbers and people skills. Witnessing the contentment of the employees at that firm, Chris starts yearning for that life. The following morning, Chris informs Linda that he'll be late because he plans to stop by an office and apply as a stockbroker. Linda finds this notion absurd and mocks his seemingly far-fetched dream. This leads to a heated argument that only concludes when Linda reminds him of the 2 months' worth of rent they owe. Later on, Chris heads to a brokerage firm to apply for the job. They only hire 20 people every 6 months, and only one will secure the position. Wanting to make a good impression, he entrusts the scanner to a street performer and slips her some cash to keep an eye on it. Once inside, he learns more about the job and grabs an application. Suddenly, he spots the street performer making off with the scanner through the window. Without a second thought, Chris rushes out, hot on her heels through the city in the station, but she manages to escape on a train. The next day, Chris assures Linda that he'll sell the scanner so it's no longer a reminder. However, he first heads back to the firm to submit the completed application. He ensures he personally hands it over to Jay, the head of the resource department, hoping to make a good impression. Unfortunately, Jay is in a rush and promises to call later. Afterwards, Chris spots the street performer and her accomplice passing by with the scanner. Fuming, he starts chasing them, only to realize he's poured his entire life savings into those scanners. They were touted as revolutionary, but Chris didn't anticipate that doctors and hospitals would consider them extravagant. For Chris, losing a scanner is akin to losing a month's worth of groceries. After an intense pursuit, Chris manages to corner the duo on a bus and reclaims the scanner. This means that when he gets home, instead of selling the scanner he initially had, he now has two. Linda is visibly disappointed but holds her tongue because it's Junior's birthday. They've scraped together some money to buy him a basketball to keep him happy, but in that moment, Linda communicates her frustration with Chris's lack of responsibility while Junior is distracted. A month later, Chris decides to check on the status of his job application with Jay, but Jay is in a rush. Chris pretends to be heading the same way and suggests they share a taxi, using the opportunity to showcase his skills once more. However, Jay is preoccupied with solving a Rubik's Cube and keeps failing. Frustrated, Chris takes the cube and effortlessly solves it by the time they reach Jay's destination. Jay is thoroughly impressed, but instead of paying for the taxi, he abruptly exits, leaving Chris with the bill. Clearly, Chris doesn't have the cash, so he hastily disembarks at a traffic light and dashes away, prompting the taxi driver to give chase. Desperate, Chris rushes into a train station and boards a train, but in his haste, the train's door painfully slams shut on his hand, causing him to drop his scanner in the station. This chaotic episode throws Chris's entire schedule into disarray. When he calls Linda to apologize, she's livid because she missed her shift to pick up Junior, and they were relying on that income. It's the final straw for Linda, who declares that she's leaving and taking Junior with her. Devastated by this news, Chris rushes home, but it's too late. Linda has already departed with their son and her belongings. At that moment, Jay calls Chris, instructing him to jot down his secretary's number for a follow-up interview. Without a pen in sight, Chris commits the number to memory and hurries to a nearby store to borrow some paper to write it down. The following morning, Chris confronts Linda at the daycare about the previous night's events. Linda explains that she's no longer happy in their relationship. While Chris accepts her decision to leave, he insists on retaining custody of their child, so they agree to shared custody. The absence of Linda's income exacerbates their financial woes. When their landlord tires of Chris's overdue rent, he pays a visit and demands that Chris vacate the premises the next morning for scheduled painting work. Chris vows to pay and offers to do the painting himself, so the landlord reluctantly grants him an additional week. A few days later, as Chris is painting the walls, 2 policemen arrive and take him to the station to settle his unpaid parking tickets. Unfortunately, they inform him that the verification will take place at 9:30 a.m., necessitating an overnight stay in jail. Chris pleads that he has a job interview in the morning, but his pleas fall on deaf ears. With his one phone call, Chris asks Linda to pick up Junior. The next morning, Chris is released, but is almost running late. He rushes to the interview in his shabby attire. During the interview, the panel is initially disappointed by his appearance, but Chris explains his recent circumstances, with Jay corroborating that he had previously seen Chris in proper attire. Chris's humor, wit, and intelligence impress the panel, and after the interview, Jay congratulates him. However, Chris hesitates, citing the internship's lack of salary and his changed circumstances. Jay urges Chris to continue and assures him that he will hold the position for him. Chris agrees and expects a call in the evening. Later that day, Linda drops a bombshell. She's planning to move to New York because her sister's boyfriend is opening a restaurant and she may have a job opportunity there. Chris decides to keep custody of Junior, inspired by Linda's determination to pursue her own path. He also informs her about accepting the internship, which further upsets her and leads to her departure. After Linda leaves, Chris calls Jay and accepts the job. The next day, Chris and his son relocate to a nearby motel with the assistance of a friend. On a Saturday, Chris takes his son to shoot some hoops, and Junior expresses his dream of becoming a pro. Chris gives him a reality check, explaining that it's a tough road, but when Junior gets disheartened, Chris lifts his spirits, emphasizing that he should never let anyone, not even himself, tell him he can't do something. Later, they head to the hospital and finally make a sale with the scanner, providing some much-needed funds to keep them afloat for a bit longer. Chris embarks on his first day of the internship the next morning, immersing himself in learning the trade. He puts in relentless effort to prove he's the best candidate for the position, never letting on about his financial struggles. During lunch, Chris encounters his boss Mr. Frome on the street and attempts to engage in a conversation, hoping to make a favorable impression. However, his attention shifts when he spots the eccentric man with the scanner, still convinced it's a time machine. Chris immediately gives chase, pursuing him through the streets and traffic, but ends up being hit by a car. He loses sight of the man but also loses a shoe in the process, yet he returns to the office nonchalantly, playing it cool. Over the ensuing days, Chris continues to do favors for office manager Frake Shn, makes numerous phone calls to attract clients, but with little success. To complicate matters, he has to leave early to pick up Junior, meaning he has to complete the same workload in less time than his colleagues. This leads to Chris never hanging up the phone, neglecting to drink water, and foregoing bathroom breaks. He avoids the motel manager, who he owes money to, and brings Junior along when he visits hospitals on weekends to try and sell his remaining machines. One day, Chris decides to shake up his routine to speed up the process, making a daring call that lands him an appointment with top-level pension fund manager Mr. Ribbon. Ribbon instructs him to come to his office in 20 minutes. Chris rushes to leave the building, only for Frake to ask him to move his car. Left with no choice, Chris attempts to park quickly, but by the time he reaches the meeting, Ribbon has already left. The following morning, Chris visits Ribbon's house, pretending to be in the area. He thanks Ribbon for the opportunity and offers his apologies once more, then invents plans to take Junior to a football game. Ribbon reveals he's going with his own child and invites Chris and Junior to join them in his private box. During the game, Chris pitches his sales spiel to Ribbon, but despite Ribbon's admission that he likes Chris, he's not interested. However, Chris manages to obtain the contact information of Ribbon's affluent acquaintances. Weeks pass with Chris juggling his internship and scanner sales, but the day arrives for the IRS to seize money from Chris's bank account for unpaid taxes, rendering him penniless. In desperation, he approaches an old friend for the money he borrowed, but the friend claims he already repaid him when he assisted with a move. This infuriates Chris, but his friend shuts the door on him. Sometime later, Chris spots the eccentric man with the scanner again while at the park with his son. Chris immediately goes after him and reclaims his machine, which is now in a sorry state. Chris cleans it and attempts to sell it to a doctor, but sadly, the machine doesn't work. When Chris and Junior return to the motel, they find their belongings outside and discover the lock has been changed due to non-payment. Chris tries unsuccessfully to pick the lock and open the window, leaving them homeless. Since his friend still refuses to help, Chris takes Junior to the train station. While waiting for the train, Junior observes that the scanner isn't a time machine as the eccentric man claimed. Chris insists that it is and initiates a game to lift Junior's spirits, pretending they're time travelers who can witness dinosaurs. He then suggests that good cavemen need a cave, so they sneak into the station's restroom and lock the door. They spend the night there on a makeshift bed of toilet paper, and while Junior sleeps, Chris allows himself to shed some tears. The following day, Chris and Junior head to a homeless shelter, but they're turned away because it's reserved for women and children. Fortunately, they receive a tip about another shelter and dash over just in time, securing one of the last 4 available spots. At the shelter, a hobo attempts to cut in and snatch the last spot, but Chris swiftly defends his place. When security catches wind of the cheating, Chris secures the final room. In this humble abode, Chris makes the most of the limited light, working on fixing the scanner and studying for his internship exam. When he heads to work, he brings his meager possessions along, concocting excuses to his colleagues for carrying bags around. Over the ensuing days, Chris successfully brings in clients to the firm using the contacts he gathered. On exam day, nerves set in, but Chris manages to complete the test swiftly. On his way out, he crosses paths with Frome, who's just stepped out of a taxi and urgently asks Chris for $5 to cover the fare. Despite not being able to spare the money, Chris obliges to save face. This delay, however, causes him to miss the shelter's curfew, leading to a night spent sleeping on a train. The following day, Chris resorts to donating blood for some cash, using it to purchase a spare part for the scanner. This time, they make it to the shelter in time, allowing Chris to finally repair his machine. Back in their beds, Junior wonders if his mother left because of him. Chris takes the time to reassure and comfort him, making sure he knows it wasn't his fault. The next day, they successfully sell the scanner, and to lift Junior's spirits, Chris treats them to a night at a hotel. They spend the weekend together on the beach, finding solace in each other's company and taking a well-deserved breather. On his final day as an intern, Chris has a chance encounter with Jay in the washroom, receiving congratulations for bringing in numerous clients and receiving praise for his outstanding work. Later, Chris is summoned to Frome's office, where he receives the news he's been longing for. He's secured the permanent position he'd been working so hard for. He's set to start the very next day, and to seal the deal, Frome returns the $5. As Chris steps out of the building, tears stream down his face as he embraces the realization of his happiness. He then heads to pick up his son, holding him tightly, ready to embark on their new journey. In time, the real Chris went on to establish his own multi-million-dollar brokerage firm, amassing significant wealth by selling his minority stake in the company. He also authored a highly successful book detailing his extraordinary journey.